Yes, good morning, everyone. Hello, I'm Deb Bauer, Community Engagement and Volunteer Coordinator here at Hope House. Welcome to this great webinar today, Human Trafficking in Rural Wisconsin, Recognizing an Epidemic. We're all glad you found the time to join us for this very, very important webinar presented by two very dedicated Hope House advocates. The mission of Hope House is to prevent abuse and provide support to victims of all types of domestic and sexual violence. We provide services in Sauk, Columbia, Juneau, Marquette, and Adams counties, and we include a 24/7 helpline, supportive counseling, support groups, advocacy, children's programming, community education, and an emergency shelter. And now a little about our two presenters. Sarah Yankee is an anti-human trafficking advocate here at Hope House. She works with victims and survivors of human trafficking by connecting them with resources and providing supportive services. She's also able to give presentations to community partners. Sarah would like to remind people that our services are free and confidential and that we are not mandated reporters. She feels this is important to mention so that victims and survivors can feel safe reaching out and connecting with her without having to fear judgment or repercussions. Danielle Pinckney is the manager of the sexual assault program here at Hope House. She oversees dedicated sexual assault and anti-human trafficking advocates. Danielle recognizes that sometimes language can be a barrier for survivors seeking services and feels it's important for people to know we have on staff Spanish-speaking bilingual advocates and access to resources that allow us to communicate with survivors in the language they feel most comfortable expressing themselves. Now, as we get started here, know that this is a safe place. There may be some triggers for some of you in today's content, so please take care of yourself. And again, welcome. I hope you find the next 70 or so minutes extremely beneficial. And now I'll hand it off to our speakers.
And Sarah, I just wanted, okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to make sure that you knew we couldn't hear you yet.
Yes, no problem. Thank you both so much. And hello again, and welcome to the Human Trafficking in Wisconsin webinar. We're excited you're with us today, and we hope that we will be able to share a little bit about what we see here in Wisconsin, share our knowledge, and hopefully you'll leave this webinar with tools and knowledge that you can use in your communities. So this is Sarah speaking, and I will be with you for the first part of the webinar. Just some housekeeping items. Like Deb mentioned, I did want to mention that we have some content and trigger warnings. Please note that this presentation contains topics that might be offensive or traumatizing. I've noted discussion topics might include child abuse, sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, substance abuse, and things of that nature. If you need to leave the webinar at any time, please feel free to do so. Again, we're recording this and we'll be sending it out to participants. There we go. So, what's human trafficking? Let's take a little bit of time to do just a quick refresh on what human trafficking is. Our presentation today goes a little bit beyond the basics of what human trafficking looks like and goes into how it's perpetrated, who the perpetrators are, and what victims might look like. We wanted to give you this brief piece just to remind you what trafficking is and some quick facts. And I want to highlight that human trafficking is the exploitation of a person through force, fraud, or coercion. And that's something that's going to come up in a lot of places in the following presentation. Also important to note, there are several different types of human trafficking, and those are listed here with a little bit of information about each of them. We will be focusing on sex trafficking today and what that looks like in Wisconsin and in our rural communities. And I know this can be a little bit hard to read, so we are going to be sending out those slides. So if you want to take a closer look, you'll be able to do that. So what about Wisconsin? This is what we're going to be focusing on today for the most part, and I was able to pull some data to give you kind of an overview about what this looks like in our state. I do want to note that we took our statistics and their 2019 statistics from the Human Trafficking Hotline. 2019 was the latest data available to us when we put this webinar together. The Human Trafficking Hotline and the Polaris Project, which is the organization that operates the hotline, are really good about tracking and updating things that come into them. I also chose to utilize them because of the nature of their reporting. In early 2020, the Wisconsin Attorney General Josh Call released a law enforcement assessment that also had quite a bit of data and is available online at the DOJ website. And as with many other sensitive crimes, sex crime victims are hesitant to come forward, or cases might be mischaracterized, leading to underreporting. And while the human trafficking hotline numbers are far from all inclusive, we know that human trafficking in Wisconsin is severely underreported, as it is in much of the rest of the country. The hotline most accurately represents what's happening in the state of Wisconsin, as there are victims that will come forward but not necessarily want to report to law enforcement, but they do want to seek help or find other services or resources, and so they'll call the hotline to get that. And the law enforcement assessment is specifically an assessment of what participating law enforcement departments have in their records. Just a couple quick points on this slide. The majority of trafficking victims that was reported was for sex trafficking, and those victims were mostly adult US citizens and women. And now that we've gotten our overview and our broad stats out of the way, I want to get into the topics that we highlighted when we sent out the information for this webinar. And so we're going to start today with online trafficking. When we think of online trafficking, we probably think about a lot of things, and the first thing that comes to mind is social media, and rightfully so. There's a plethora of social media websites out there, and there are some that I don't even know about, and I feel like there are ones being developed all the time. I have listed some of the big social media sites and apps that have come up in our experiences, in news stories, and things of that nature. So traffickers will use social media to reach out to their victims initially. This may be acquaintances, or they may be friends of friends, and they often just kind of go out looking for people that might be willing to talk to them. For instance, I know of someone who was approached by somebody that was friends with someone in her school. He sent a message to her on Facebook Messenger, and she accepted the message, and they started talking as friends and kind of building up that rapport. And traffickers do this to see where they might be able to get in. They there are vulnerabilities that this person might have. For instance, if it's a teen, do they talk about how unhappy they are at home, or if school is hard, or if they're being bullied, or something like that. Traffickers will use this as a way to get in and build that trust with the person they're targeting. They start grooming them and sympathizing with them, trying to come from a place they know that the victim can be exploited. Once this happens and they build that relationship, they'll start asking for things. It might be a trade-off where they promised to do something for somebody, or they gave somebody something in return, something along those lines, and they're expecting something back. Traffickers look for situations and feelings that are easy to exploit and manipulate. It could be they're talking to a child or teen with low or no self-esteem, or a potential victim that is in a particularly vulnerable position, maybe someone like a teenager who knows that being approached by an adult and brought into a conversation is wrong to begin with, but maybe that adult threatened to go to their parents. Or maybe this is the only attention that a teen has really gotten in a while. And an adult is almost always in the position of power in these situations, and the victim may think that they can't say no. And so they will send the trafficker something. And when that happens, the trafficker then has something to hold over them. And that is when things take a turn for the worse. Traffickers will hold that piece of leverage over the victims, things like messages, videos, pictures, anything that they can use to exert power over the victim. And they'll continue to ask for more and more things. It might be more pictures, it might be more videos, and then they turn around and send that off to their friends. Or they might start setting up meetups, and the victims will be assaulted in those meetings. It goes from there. So This is also where the recruiting piece can come in. I have seen instances where it starts with one girl, and if she wants to get out or if she wants to stop what's happening and she voices that to her trafficker, the trafficker will likely ask for her to essentially replace herself. Sometimes that's by putting a price on her freedom, usually an extremely high amount that no victim is able to pay, or he will ask for her to bring in her friends to make up for her leaving. And even if that happens, the likelihood of the trafficker letting the victim leave is pretty low. And by that, I don't mean that he holds the victim captive. I mean that he makes it impossible for the victim to have a life outside of that world. The trafficker is in control of finances, of who the victim talks to, all aspects like that. Sometimes the victim stays to avoid traffickers sharing pictures or telling adults what's going on, or in the case of adults, perhaps stop them from sharing pictures that might embarrass them professionally or with their families or things of that nature. We also often see that traffickers will threaten the lives of family members as a way to control the victim, and the victim stays to protect their family. I have also included online gaming to this piece as well. Just briefly, with these games, there's usually a chat function. While there are ways to turn it off and go offline, there are parental guidances. Most tech-savvy kids can get around those. And the issue with this is that they'll be playing with strangers, or these strangers will contact players and try to get them to exchange personal information or meet them on a second platform. Some of it is scammers, and depending on the scam, these people are likely being used to recruit and are being exploited in different ways and don't see any of that money coming in. A lot of these games are free and rated E, so anyone can play, and that attracts a wide age group. A trafficker will usually start a conversation and then move it off the platform and onto another one that's less monitored, like messaging apps. This is another big one. Things like Kik and WhatsApp are pretty anonymous, and that is why they are appealing. There are a lot of incidences that you've probably heard of with these messaging apps, and this is the way that predators set up communication with their victims. Or traffickers will connect with someone on social media and move that conversation over to these messaging apps so that it's a more private conversation and harder to track. I have included Skype and Zoom and an app called House Party, because they've definitely come up more with this pandemic. Zoom and House Party, unless you lock a room, and even sometimes if you do lock the room, depending on how determined a hacker is, they can definitely get into those video rooms and take them over, and depending on what's happening in them, use that to exploit someone. There's been incidences of teenagers who have been having parties on an app like House Party, and someone has come in and taken pictures or screenshots where you could identify the people that were there and use them to exploit the people participating. And you could kind of think about it this way. When you were in high school, and if you went to parties as a teenager, there was maybe underage drinking and you didn't want to get in trouble, right? Well, now that's on video, and the traffickers or the perpetrators can go to basically anyone. They can go to threaten the parents, they can threaten to go to the school, they can threaten to go to the police, and the potential victim would be in trouble. And depending on who you are and what you participate in, there can be a lot at stake. You could get, you could get kicked off of sports, or you could be punished by your parents. It's just little things like this to think about on apps that maybe people don't think is a big deal. And I've also included Google Voice specifically because there's a lot of anonymity around that. I'm not sure how many of you have Google Voice. I have Google Voice basically as a throwaway phone number for if I'm signing up for like an e-commerce website that wants a phone number. I don't want them to sell my number and get a bunch of spam calls all the time. So Google Voice is an app that I downloaded. I got to choose my own number, and I can choose my number from basically any area code. So it can be pretty anonymous. It does sync with a Google account, but anybody can fake anything these days. So it's just good to be on the lookout for that one as well. So I think websites and dating apps are the other really big ones that people think about when they think about trafficking. Craigslist is still a big player in trafficking and sex work, period. There are still personal ads, and they can get creative and list the ads under different sections as well. Backpage was a large website. And if you go there now, you'll notice the webpage has a huge government seal on it, stating that the government has seized control of the webpage. And that happened in about January 2017. The founder and executives of Backpage were called before the Senate to testify about what their website was all about. They were subsequently charged with human trafficking. I wanted to note that Backpage is defunct in the United States, but it's still operating in other places around the world. And Skip the Games is something that is relatively new to my lexicon and knowledge, and it's basically a website that is replacing Backpage. And from the articles that I have read, and I don't go to these websites, it is more in your face about the personals, like what it has, what it's advertising, and it, from what I've read, is pretty damaging. Dating apps are a huge piece of web traffic in the United States. Some dating apps and websites take things a little bit more seriously than others. Others definitely have more of a reputation for things like solicitation, catfishing, and trafficking. And dating apps can be tricky because you can be anyone. We've all heard about the show Catfish, right? It was originally a documentary film that was done by a man who was catfished by a woman up in northern Wisconsin. People portray themselves to be someone else, and they build that relationship with you and build that trust with you. There are people who go to meet up with someone that they've met online and it's not who they are, and that can be a difficult situation, or the person might keep it a completely online relationship, and the person might request explicit photos or monies or things along those lines, and then use those again to get what they want from somebody. I listed a few of the ones that I've seen come up more often than others. I've also included some escort service websites on here, and those concepts are pretty popular. They start out innocuous. The legal premise is that there are people who will pay other people basically to be their friend, and they, I guess, have all this money and don't know what to do with it, and they want friendship. A lot of they're called sugar babies, go into it understanding, okay, the person that's buying is paying for my clothes, or he pays for my car payment, or he gives me a monthly allowance. And in return, I go out to dinner with him twice a month, or I talk to him on the phone once a week. And they basically just provide that companionship. To my understanding, this is all legal and on the up and up. And where it twists is that sometimes the buyer wants to change the relationship, and the people that they've bought rely on this work for their lifestyles. So maybe they're paying their way through college, or it's supplemental income or something like that. So if they're approached by the person who's funding their lifestyle, they may not be able to say no, or they will say no, and then they're threatened with being cut off. So then maybe they give in and send a picture or something like that. And that's something that the person who's the buyer, called a sugar daddy usually, they can use that to manipulate them. Or it might not be a picture. Maybe someone's doing this and their family doesn't know about it, so they'll threaten to expose them personally or professionally. So in the world of escort services, things can definitely start out consensual and might take a turn into the exploitation territory pretty easily. And it's hard to think about this, but this is also sometimes how traffickers are able to traffic children. If they find someone that's in a financially vulnerable situation and that they can't provide for them what they need or what they want, they might ask someone for something that they do have. So someone might meet somebody online and they get a bunch of money as a loan perhaps, and the trafficker comes back and says, I need this money back, you have to pay me back or else. And if this person can't, the trafficker may say, well, you have kids and you can send me a picture of them. Something like that. And it's horrific to think about. Many victims of trafficking are doing what they need to do to survive, and it shouldn't be assumed that we understand everything that's going on in a victim's life. So for online trafficking, I would say prevention is key. You don't have to ban anyone from gaming or social media, but as with anything, it's good to be active and aware of what kids and teens are doing on these sites and these games. They probably won't like the questions, but it signals to them that you're aware of what they're doing, that you support them, and then you care about them. Remind your family members you're there for them. Explain those concerns. Let them know you aren't judging them. and you care about their safety more than anything else. I would say most kids are scared when they're approached this way because they're scared of reactions they might receive from parents or guardians or other adults, and they're scared of punishment. So a good way to avoid that is just to have that open communication. Be mindful of who you add on social media and who you give information to. And now might also be a good time to remind you that you should check your privacy settings and really take control of what is out there of you and your family members. So we'll move on to myths, misinformation, truths, and discuss what trafficking looks like. So let's talk about some of the victim myths and who they are. I've listed a few common categories that people tend to put their idea of a victim into, and then what the reality is. It's been noted all over the place that anyone can be a victim of trafficking, and that's true. And I think it's easier for us to be able to put trafficking victims into categories that we think we can understand or accept, because we don't want to think about the head cheerleader on your daughter's team being trafficked by some guy she met on the internet. Or we don't want to think about parents who traffic their children to make the rent. Trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, those have all gone up during the course of this pandemic, and it's being reported everywhere, right? So we don't want to think about someone who may have lost their job, and the way that they're trying to pay the bills is that they became a bartender at a strip club maybe. And while throughout the course of their work, they met someone who said they could help them out, and they agree, and that ends up being that they're used or trafficked for sex or pictures or whatever the trafficker decides they might need that day. It's also easy to assume that if someone's being trafficked, it's because they use drugs or it's how they get their drugs. And the reality of it is that not everyone who gets into trafficking is addicted to drugs. They might be introduced to drugs as a means to control them by their trafficker, but that's not all victims. And just to remind you what we saw about what trafficking looks like in Wisconsin, that number for sex trafficking involved citizens was higher than trafficking involving non-citizens. And I know that we predominantly think of people who are trafficked as girls, but like we said earlier, anyone can be a victim, and there's definitely a higher rate of trafficking in marginalized communities and the LGBTQ plus community, and we'll be getting into that a little bit later. So we've discussed some generals of what traffickers kind of look like, what they use and what their motivations are. It's worth noting that just like anyone can be a victim, anyone can be a trafficker. We tend to think of the scariest type of person in our minds because it's harder to imagine that a father or mother would traffic their own child. And I think this might be a good place to bring up that sexual abuse as a child can turn into something like trafficking. And what I mean by that is someone who's a victim of incest or abuse as a child might only really know that kind of a world if they've never gotten help beyond that. It's something that's familiar to them, even if it's a terrible reality. And as they enter adulthood, they seek out something that is familiar like that. Someone who controls them, someone who abuses them, and that can make them vulnerable and easy to manipulate, and someone that a trafficker would target. Many abused children and adults alike will do what it takes to survive. So stories and promises are one of the greatest weapons that a trafficker has. They'll make all kinds of promises to the person that they're preying on. They look for anything that they can exploit. There have been instances where someone gets out of being trafficked by somebody else because they met someone through the course of being trafficked who promised to get them out of that life, and they promised to get them out or promised to get them help. And then when they got out and got to that person turned around and trafficked them as well. Traffickers make a lot of promises. It might be money, it might be love, it might be drugs. And I wish that I had a crystal ball to hold up to somebody to know whether or not that person is someone that is being trafficked or might traffic somebody, but we don't have that. So it's important to take what we have learned about traffickers and apply that knowledge to situations that we might come across. And so let's go into a little more detail with some common myths and misconceptions. We're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into trafficking myths surrounding children, teens, and adults individually, and we'll start with children. I've gathered some headlines that have come from around the country from about 5 years ago to this past fall. And I think the biggest lesson we can take away from these headlines is to remember that not everything you read or hear or see on the internet is true. It's a simple statement, but one worth repeating frequently. A lot of these conspiracy theories have come from a very dark place, and they can do lasting damage. I think it is in our nature to be attracted to sensationalized stories, and it's certainly what spreads the fastest, true or not. For instance, you've probably seen posts on Twitter or Facebook about children being abducted during the pandemic because they were wearing masks, or that people have been stalked in the Walmart parking lot and they think that they could be abducted. So in our field, we don't really see or read or hear about a real sex trafficking situation in which a child was abducted by traffickers in broad daylight at a busy store under someone's eye. It's just not how that works. Traffickers, like we've discussed, tend to coerce their victims because picking them up and taking them off is just too risky. It's easier for victims to be recruited and manipulated and to be made dependent on their trafficker. Traffickers use that psychological and emotional tie, and it's incredibly effective. However, with children, common patterns of sex trafficking, recruitment, and control involve parents, foster parents, guardians, or other trusted adults selling their own children or children they know. And that is extremely harsh, and it's unpleasant to think about. Another suggestion that I would have is take the time to do your research. A lot of people will read one-off headlines and send them off into the world without having read the article and understanding the issues within the article. So specifically, the headline I'm looking at is the Missing Children Rescued in Georgia Sex Trafficking Bust. That was written by the AP, and the headline is extremely misleading. There was also a recent story, I believe, that came out on Friday, similar in Los Angeles. So what had actually happened in Georgia was not an anti-trafficking operation at all. It was a collaboration between state and federal authorities to locate 78 critically missing children. That term includes children who might be at risk for trafficking, but they are also at great risk of parental abuse or have a medical condition that make their recovery more urgent. And that operation was a success. They managed to find all but 13 of those 78 missing children they were looking for. Of that 65, 39 were recovered, meaning they were removed from whatever situation they were in. And that could be anything from they were living on the street or sleeping at a friend's house or staying with a parent who didn't have legal custody. That operation net only one new charge of sex trafficking against the perpetrator, and most of the charges were for probation violations, unlawful possession of a firearm, and violating custody agreements. But because this story came out when the national and local talk was about sex trafficking conspiracies, this got a lot of attention. People shared this story and the false Wayfair and Amazon and other e-commerce trafficking stories with the hashtag Save the Children. And the damage of attaching false stories to that hashtag was that it blotted out the real work that was being highlighted with hashtag Save the Children. Save the Children is an actual organization, and it was founded over 100 years ago in England, and they do humanitarian work to support children around the world. There are many legitimate organizations that work to bring attention to the situations and issues affecting children who use that hashtag in their publications. So if you click on that and you are inundated with conspiracy theories, it wipes out the work that's actually being done to help children and bring attention to their needs. There have been articles, investigations, statements, all debunking these conspiracy theories. So I ask you to please not spread them. We'll move on to teens. Teens are a very hard group to understand and work on on our best days. Remember, being a teenager, everything was a big deal. Your needs as a teen are different from what they are as children, and different from what they will be as adults. You're kind of caught in that cross where you want to be grown up and independent, but you're still a minor. Being a teenager is now harder than even when I was a teenager. Cyberbullying exists, and it did not exist for me there are always pressures on teens to fit in and be somebody that maybe they really aren't. And they don't necessarily have the ability to voice this, or they're afraid to voice it because of repercussions from adults or their peers. The depiction of teen trafficking victims are sensationalized in movies pretty frequently. I put up the movie Taken, which is one of the big ones that people reference. To be honest, the likelihood that your child will be kidnapped because you are a high-powered CIA agent here in Wisconsin is extremely unlikely. But it's that sensationalized piece. Again, the risk outweighs the reward for a trafficker. It's easier for them to take the time to manipulate and create a bond with someone than it is to outright abduct them. I've also highlighted the Green Lake County bus from December of 2019, as that teen was a runaway. Something to examine is our conception of what a runaway is. I think we most often default to an unhappy teen that's mad at their parents and they run away and get kidnapped. In reality, maybe they did leave their home because something was happening and they're picked up at a bus stop or a fast food shelter by a trafficker who will exploit their hunger and their need for shelter. But another one that ties back to that online predation is that maybe an older man had reached out to a young girl online and she thinks she's fallen in love with him, and he tells her he loves her and he convinces her to leave her home and run away with him, only for him to turn around and pimp her out. If a teen is looking for something and they don't think that it's being met in the things that they know and that are familiar to them, that psychological and emotional tie that a trafficker will develop with them is incredibly effective. I think that another common misconception can be what these traffickers look like in this situation. I've pulled 2 more local stories involving the superintendent from Altoona. Traffickers can be folks that we place in the trust with children, and when the story came out and what was involved in that trafficking piece, there were things that were missed. You know, teenagers in your lives, and it might be uncomfortable to have an uncomfortable conversation to have, but investing in them, showing them that you care enough to ask them questions if you think something is off or if you think something is wrong could go a long way in the end. And finally, in this section, this isn't necessarily trafficking related, but I think it puts things into frame a little bit more. The way that we speak about girls and teenagers and young women is big when it comes to perception, right? So I've put an image of R. Kelly and Jeffrey Epstein up. The stories that were written about these 2 people and the way the words that were used in those stories is impactful. When we say someone has sex with an underage woman, it implies that it's not that serious, that it was okay if she were 18. Sex with a minor or sex with a child is not a thing. That is assault. It's plain and simple. To use the phrases that I mentioned minimizes and diminishes what victims go through, and we need to be mindful of that. And another thing that people may not necessarily associate with this because they think it's different or a lighter subject is the issue of revenge porn. I've seen a lot of comments about, well, she chose to pose for her boyfriend and she should have known better, or she shouldn't have been texting a guy that she met on a dating app, or whatever the case may be. And we tend to brush it aside and put the onus back on the victim and shame the choices that they made and judge them. But being threatened with revenge porn, or the threat of having yourself be even more exposed, is something that someone can exploit pretty easily and lead to something more serious. So human trafficking in general is something that's usually pretty subtle. When it comes to adult trafficking victims, things can get extremely complicated extremely quickly. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of victims don't self-identify as trafficking victims. What they are involved in is survival. It is worth noting that not all trafficking victims want to leave that world. It's what they're familiar with. The person that is hurting them is the same person that is providing for them. And it can be very hard to explain to somebody that you're going to take them away from that or ask them to leave the situation that they see as safer than being out. This person provides food for them, shelter for them, maybe they provide childcare for them, and yes, sometimes they provide drugs. And a lot goes into making the decision to leave something that is the safest thing that they know. Regardless, they are still victims. Say that someone did end up being trafficked because of their addiction. Perhaps the drug they started using was to numb pain for somewhere else in their lives, and they thought, and through this, that happened, they ended up not having a job, or they were homeless, and someone came along and told them they could get them drugs or they could provide them a place to stay. To someone who's trying to survive, that sounds incredibly appealing, and they might not be thinking about that and what comes further down the line, what those possibilities look like. And I think we need to pause when it comes to judging drug users and when we come across drug users, perhaps in our line of work or in the community. It's one of those things where, again, you don't know who they are and you don't know where this might be coming from. And if someone wants to leave and be sober, those barriers are huge. For people who work in our communities, they know those resources aren't there. There's not a ton of help and resources and funding for someone trying to quit addiction. It is hard enough to make the decision to quit, let alone deal with what comes after it. And going back to the story of maybe they used because they were abused as a child, when they detox and they come out of that, those memories might come back, and it's easier sometimes for them to relapse. Addicts need a support system around them, and they need, right now, for all those resources, even the resources that we have here at Hope House, that might still not be enough. Another quick note about drug use and trafficking. Someone who might be trafficked and they were not a drug user before they were trafficked, but their trafficker has maybe injected them against their will and they've become addicted to something like heroin, which we all know is incredibly addictive. It is a means of controlling somebody. It is a scary thing to think about, and I think our default is to believe that no one could make anyone take or do a drug that they didn't want to do, but I've worked with enough survivors to know differently. Another thing to point out would be that we say over and over and over again that trafficking exists and is happening in Wisconsin, and we only really ever hear about the big busts, it seems, or we don't hear about any busts at all. And that can be because trafficking is hard to identify, or perhaps a planned bust didn't produce what they were going after. And there's a small piece in the lower left-hand corner discussing the annual FBI cross-country initiative. It's worth noting not every department participates in that for one reason or another. So if the FBI does a bust like that, which is something that can make headlines, we don't necessarily see anything from our area in it because agencies in our area may not be participating in it. I also chose to highlight a headline about the Nexium sex trafficking ring that has been in the news. I believe in December, the cult leader was sentenced for his part in his conviction of sex trafficking. This touches back to what traffickers can look like and that a lot of them can be women, just for that recruiting piece. And that's also to remind us that anyone can be a victim. So briefly, if you haven't watched The Vow on HBO, which I highly recommend, Nexium is or was a sex cult in New York State. It started out like a self-help organization and a pyramid scheme, essentially. You would go to courses, they would teach you how to present and be your best self, and then they would ask you to recruit others to participate. And this all seems pretty innocuous. Things like that happen frequently. This is just one that so happened to have a pull with celebrities, so it got a lot of attention. There are actors and actresses and writers and directors that were a part of what became this cult. Where it starts to get a little dark is the way that they went about what they were doing. The classes were organized and designed basically to break you down and make you question every preconceived notion that you had about yourself and ask you if you thought you were good enough. And the catch is that you were basically never good enough. Something could always be improved. And if you had a thought that didn't align with what the cult said, there were punishments or you had to do reparations. So they were building on that dependency piece and the exploitation of insecurities that someone might have. And this is probably starting to sound familiar from our discussion so far. As time went on, there were small sections within the cult that created their own new sections. The sex trafficking one operated by someone inviting you to be a part of a specific special program, and to be a part of it, you had to give collateral. It was basically a test of loyalty. If you were offered to become part of this program, you were somebody that they thought was worth investing in. People would give nude photos, sometimes they would give videos bad-mouthing their spouses, things of that nature. And at first they didn't ask you to do too much, but the longer you were in, the more control someone exerted over you. How much you ate, how much you slept, how quickly you responded to messages and things like that. someone who had been in the cult since its inception didn't really take a step back to look at what was happening until the cult decided to start branding people. They were told they couldn't tell anybody about this piece of that cult, not their spouses, business partners. It operated in secrecy. And that's a big part of a lot of trafficking. People are shamed into doing things or threatened. And while there might not be cults we know of recruiting sex trafficking victims in Wisconsin, it is worth noting that something as unassuming as attending a seminar can lead to bigger things that we might not be able to conceive of right now. We might be quick to judge somebody who comes forward. We'll say, well, you're an adult, you make your own decisions, and you have free will. And that can be incredibly harmful. And these are things that people say and post in response to trafficking stories on the internet when people try to have open discussions. So I challenge everyone that before you post a story or like a comment or add a comment, to do your homework and read that story and think about where it comes from and think about who it's going to impact and think about survivors and victims who might see it. Think critically about what effect these narratives and responses may have on those that are most at risk or on survivors and on attempts to educate people and fight this crime. Pay attention to stats, seek out legitimate interest groups who are working on the issue, and look at the evidence that is presented by survivors. Don't let a sensationalized, scary story blind you to what sex trafficking is about and what it really looks like. So moving on a little bit here. Solicitation. So we've talked about online solicitation, what that looks like and where people do that. I think it's very important to define the difference between sex work, and sex trafficking. Oftentimes the terms are used interchangeably, or people assume that someone who engages in sex work is also being trafficked. Again, we don't walk in other people's shoes and we don't know what is occurring in their lives. There's a stigma that is attached to sex work that also relates to sex trafficking. People feel shame. Many times sex trafficking victims don't understand that might be what is happening to them, and remember they're doing what they have to survive. And if they think they're going to get in trouble for prostitution or solicitation, or they're embarrassed to tell somebody that this is happening to them, they're less likely to get help and more likely to be caught in the criminal justice system and cycle through that way without getting the help they need or the identification. Also, one might go into sex work willingly only to later become trafficked because their autonomy is taken from them by threat or use of force. Strip clubs are numerous in our area and are ripe for sex trafficking to occur. I think there is a judgment that comes from people who, or towards people who choose to work in a strip club, whether they're a dancer or a bartender or anything like that. We tend to say they made those choices, they put themselves at risk. Again, this is an instance where we don't know what brought someone to work there, and it's unfair to assume that someone you come into contact with at a strip club is willfully approaching you or soliciting you. And yes, that can be part of their job, something that they entered into willingly. I've known people who have put themselves through college by working in strip clubs and didn't have issues, but for others, it can quickly turn into something that is controlled by somebody else. That outdoor solicitation piece lines up pretty well with what we think sex work looks like. And it's important to remember that just because that's what it looks like doesn't mean that's actually what's going on. That truck stop and rest area piece can fit in here as well. It's important to remember that people who might be approaching truck drivers or people who stop off may not be knowingly doing it on their own free will. And another piece that can sometimes fit into this is that people who are peddling or begging, there have been reports of people that are doing this that turn out to be trafficking victims. And we might not see that a ton around here. That might be more in the bigger cities, but just to be aware of that. And it is not just a big city issue. So let's take sex trafficking out of the cities and look at what it what it means here. So let's talk about sex trafficking in our area. We have a lot of tourist areas in our communities. It's not just what is happening within the community, but also happening on the way to these communities. Rural areas have a lot of truck stops and rest areas because of the highways that run through them, and they're not necessarily as common in city areas. These locations are isolated, and that makes them convenient for transient customers to purchase sex with a minimal probability of detection. Likewise, a truck stop can be an easy place for a trafficker to sell victims night after night to new people. Similarly, tourist areas have a high turnover of population that can make investigations difficult because witnesses and suspects alike go home or go to different areas. Wisconsin Dells is frequently listed on escort websites, and there is a reason that Wisconsin continuously ranks in the top 5 for human trafficking. A lot of misconceptions that are around this as well is that trafficking victims might be contacted or picked up in our area and then taken to other locations, and that trafficking isn't actually happening in our communities. But as we have discussed, that isn't true. There is a perception that trafficking happens in the streets in the big cities, and the reality is that due to seclusion and isolation and just space in general in rural areas and communities, it can lead to a reduction of services and identification and delay identification. Again, that larger population in cities often provides witnesses and onlookers that notice and report crimes. And when you're, say, a county deputy and you have a huge swath of area to cover, you might not be able to be in the right spot at the right time, and that's just the nature of rural areas. So while it may not seem like it's happening here with any frequency, we know that's not true. Trafficking has been documented in all 72 counties in Wisconsin and in all community sizes. Another misconception is that victims in rural areas can more easily separate themselves from their traffickers. And aside from the issues of not being able to access services or it being harder for services to find these victims, for lack of a better word, there's this kind of small town mentality that it might hinder a victim wanting to seek help. It's that mindset of everyone knows everyone and they're ashamed and anonymity is hard. Also, because so many people know traffickers have an idea of who you know and where you might be going and where they can find you. Another big perception is that people are trafficked because they need money for drugs and they live in bad neighborhoods. The reality in rural areas is that there is a lack of economic opportunities in rural communities, and that can lead to lower income levels than urban areas. So it is not just about needing money for drugs or because someone lives in a shady part of town. The lack of financial stability or independence means that people may be more vulnerable to trafficking, especially if they do not have the means to support themselves on their own. Less economic opportunity not only makes the victims more vulnerable, but makes the entire community vulnerable. For example, children might be expected to make money to support family, leading them to take riskier jobs, and such vulnerability can also be used by traffickers to victimize children. So, why exactly is rural trafficking so hard to identify, and why don't the victims receive services that they need? I wish that I had a simple answer, but as has been through this entire presentation so far, it's more complicated. Again, victims are stigmatized. The community is where they live. It might be a place they've grown up. They know people, and it's hard for them to come forward. If you think about it, if you go to a hospital for medical treatment, you might know the nurse that's there, or you might know the person that is at the registration desk. Or if you are reporting to law enforcement, chances are they're going to know who your trafficker is. And you want to have faith that everyone's going to believe you and do their job to the best of their abilities, but it's not a guarantee. People worry about what is said about them. And what if your trafficker isn't caught or isn't prosecuted, and that's something that you have to be out with in the community every day, and that puts you at a higher risk. So it's hard for victims to come forward with this in mind. And again, victims don't always see themselves as victims. Similarly, there are cases where sex trafficking victims get caught up in sex trafficking busts or crimes. Victims aren't always identified to be victims and are often perceived to be the criminal, which leads us into this lack of training. It's not necessarily the fault of anyone. Rural law enforcement departments or emergency departments have a lot on their plate, and they can be stretched pretty thin. So it can be hard to get additional training for these frontline people. And yes, it would be great if every trafficking victim could self-identify and contact us and we could get them help, but that's just not the reality. People that are going to come across trafficking victims will most likely be healthcare workers and law enforcement officials. And so training initiatives for those folks are something that needs more attention and funding. And again, it's not necessarily through the fault of their own, but more just dealing with what they can. And along the lines of that, reporting these crimes isn't standardized. In the law enforcement assessment done by the Wisconsin DOJ, they know that when collecting stats on human trafficking, there's a lack of standardized definitions as well as reporting. I know that's something that the DOJ is working on to provide help and guidance to law enforcement agencies. Likewise, there are a lot of trainings for healthcare workers to identify trafficking victims, and even teachers and school social workers can receive training in identifying victims. And I'm again mentioning rest stops and freeways and that transient population. Just something to think about, like something could happen in La Crosse, and by the time anyone was any the wiser, that person could be in Oshkosh. So it's easy for things to get missed. People can't be everywhere all of the time. And another issue is that lack of funding. Rural communities don't always have the ability to provide what a victim might need, say funding for a law enforcement agency to have a specific training, something like that. There isn't the same kind of money flowing into rural communities like there is in larger cities. Excuse me. For instance, in Madison, I can think off the top of my head 5 different agencies that receive funding to help women get back on their feet and be successful. And this is completely different from our rural communities. Because of the physical spread of communities in rural areas with lower populations, there's less centers and less resources for the community. And fewer resources means weaker social support for victims and leaves them kind of in a lurch when they need to have that support and help. And the services that we do have in our communities might have barriers for people who need to access them. For instance, a victim may have to drive a long distance to receive help. Not everyone has transportation or gas that they can afford to do that, or time that they're able to do that. There isn't public transportation around here. There's frequently not even taxi services that can be relied upon. So if a victim doesn't have their own vehicle, they would need to borrow one or ask someone for a ride, and requests for things like that can lead to questions, and these might be questions that the victim isn't ready or doesn't want to answer. Likewise, there are services here that are needed that just aren't available. Counseling services can be hard to come by and hard to afford. Addiction recovery centers are usually located in urban centers, things of that nature. That might be secondary for us to think about are some of the most important pieces that victims think about. And for the resources that we do have, they're already pretty much at their brink. I think frequently about our housing resources. There aren't affordable housing options in rural areas, as we all know. They are few and far between. So for a system that is already overwhelmed with requests and doesn't have the funding or capacity or the resources that are needed, it makes it harder when we have additional clients and victims. I also tend to think about CPS and other child services, or the ADRC and perhaps mental health resources in the community that are already stretched thin. You know, these systems are in place in communities, and they are working to ensure children and other populations are cared for, and they can be overwhelmed and underfunded or understaffed. And we don't think about that until something happens, and then we turn around and say, well, why didn't you see that coming? Or how could you ever have let something like this happen? And I think that kind of gets laid a lot at our community resources. Everyone talks about what kind of problems we have, but it's hard to find a way to come up with solutions to those problems. So instead of recognizing that areas might be overwhelmed and doing what they can to the best of their abilities, we do try to place the blame at the feet of the people we think should be in charge of these things. And that kind of mindset doesn't help anybody. Should everyone be doing more? Absolutely. Can everyone do more? Not often. So when we talk about things that trafficking victims need and what we can do to help, sometimes the best thing that we can do is continue to talk about this and put this out there and get it into the minds of people that can help, lawmakers and government officials that might be able to work on laws or funding or permitting services for a new building or a new initiative. Those are all key things that we need. So all of this brings me to my final section, section which discusses consent and confinement. Please remember, people under the age of 18 participating even in commercial sex cannot consent, and they are by definition trafficking victims. Also, initial consent to commercial sex prior to the acts of force, fraud, and coercion, those hallmarks of sex trafficking, is not relevant to the crime. Meaning someone can go into a situation willingly if they're over the age of 18, but if the situation changes, it can become a trafficking situation, even if it's not what it looks like on its face. When we see sex trafficking portrayed in a movie, or we see a story on the news, it is often accompanied by pictures of bound hands or tape over someone's mouth, or it's otherwise implicated that the victims are being held captive, and this can be true. More likely, though, the people that are in a trafficking situation stay for reasons that are way more complicated. When victims are approached about leaving their trafficking situation, or when they think about leaving their trafficking situation, literally the basic necessities are the things that are preventing them from being able to get out. Things like transportation or a safe place to live or work or food. Some people will have criminal records that will prevent them from finding well-paying jobs, or they don't know how they would pay for a babysitter. Things like that. Some are afraid for their safety. It's incredibly risky for someone to leave their trafficking situation, and some have been so effectively manipulated, they don't think that they're under the control of somebody else. I worked with someone who trusted her trafficker so much, even though he hurt her so deeply. She was someone from a high-risk community. She has developmental disabilities, and so she functions at the level and has the emotional age of, say, a 15 or 16-year-old when she is actually 32. And the person that was trafficking her was her boyfriend. It started out as a good consensual relationship. She has control over her own life. She's able to sign her medical documents and things of that nature. So legally, she could consent. And he gave her attention that she wanted and that she deserved. She wanted to be loved. She wanted to be wanted. And that is something that people deserve if they want that. He provided for her. He bought her things. He made sure she was happy. And then he started to manipulate the situation to control her. He would go behind her back and talk to her family members and say things that weren't true, kind of breaking that bond between the two, her parents and the victim. He started following her to work and making sure where she was. And if he couldn't get in contact with her, he would use those closest to her to contact her. He became extremely controlling, and she got to the point where she did break things off with him. But he would come back and make more promises. And this went on for a while, and he broke her down, and he made her believe that she deserved everything that was happening to her and that his actions and behavior were her fault. He basically made her feel worthless. And when he got her to her lowest point where he was controlling her, he started trafficking her to his friends. He would exchange her for money, he would exchange her for drugs, and he would let her be raped for fun. At one point, he branded her. I had seen her before in my work as a sexual assault advocate. She had come in before, and she did not self-identify as a victim of trafficking. She protected his identity as most victims do. They fear retaliation and what might come with that. So she sought help for herself by coming to the hospital for an exam. The next time that she came to the hospital, she brought along a friend that she trusted, and she was not quick to trust. She told this friend what was happening to her. And because the nurse and I had training, and because she was willing to talk to us and share with us, we were able to get her the help that she needed and take the steps that she needed to get away from him. She blocked his cell phone number that very night, and he quickly found out because he couldn't get a hold of her. And he started to call her, trying to reach her through family, and she hadn't told her family what was going on. So that added another layer of issues. Our goal that night was to get her to a safe place, period, and not a lot of places we could get her to were safe. He knew where she would go, he knew what her support system was, and he knew what her home life was like. And for as much as we had in Madison, we didn't have a place where we could guarantee she would be able to get everything that she needed. We safety planned to the best of our ability and connected her with resources that we hoped would be able to help her. And this was in a larger city with dedicated trafficking resources and a larger spectrum of community resources. And we were still not able to guarantee that things would turn out for the better for her. So why does this matter? This is a situation people might not have seen as sex trafficking. We've become so accustomed to seeing the sensationalized pieces, the big flashy headlines like Robert Kraft and Jeffrey Epstein and celebrity stories. We're used to seeing and thinking about children and teens. In reality, any story that we relate to you isn't going to be comprehensive, and each case has its nuances. Some of these false narratives that I previously mentioned and those perceptions that I've shared with you today are part of the problem and detract from actual issues of human trafficking. Stories like these and sensationalized theories of trafficking in general perpetuate myths and stereotypes that are hard to break through when we are trying to reach and help victims, or when we are trying to engage and educate the community. Human trafficking is an epidemic, and it is not often spoken about. And when it is, it's in hushed voices, sometimes full of judgment or uncertainty. We are here to provide you with knowledge and facts to arm yourself with the next time you're speaking to someone or see something online. And I am glad that it is receiving much needed attention. It is my hope that people engage in this discussion wanting to learn and help, and not spread false information or perpetuate damaging myths. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to toss it over to Danny for the second part of our presentation.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the recording here from Danny. And I just also wanted to say, I know a couple people have had to hop off, and that is totally fine. I know this next recording is about 30 minutes, so we're going to run like right up to the hour, but I know that Sarah and Danny are able to hang out too. If anybody does have questions that haven't been answered in the chat, they're happy to stick around and answer those questions too. So here we go.
Marginalized communities, an overview of marginalized communities most at risk and other contributing factors. Now, while it is important we recognize that every walk of life can fall victim to human trafficking, it is also important to recognize marginalized communities are at an even greater risk of being trafficked. Data shows that the vast majority of trafficking victims identified in the United States are populations who have experienced generational trauma, historical oppression, discrimination, and other societal factors. Other risk factors include living in poverty, a history of foster care or out-of-home care, those who have struggled with addiction or grew up with a family or household member who struggled with addiction, trauma, abuse, or unstable housing. Now, Indigenous populations, LGBTQ, individuals with disability, and people of color are disproportionately victimized. In doing this work, I have discovered many well-known celebrities such as Tyler Perry, Cyndi Lauper, Ashton Kutcher, just to name a few, who are doing the work to end human trafficking. One celebrity advocate in particular is Gabrielle Union. The reason I share this is because I often reference back to her quote. In order to create real change, we've got to be willing to have real, uncomfortable, and challenging conversations. It is not enough to say these marginalized communities are at risk without sharing contributing factors that make them most at risk. What I'm about to share barely scratches the surface of generation after generation of trauma these populations have had to endure. It can also be a little intense and can be overwhelming, but in all of this, it is important to know it is not solely one person's responsibility to combat human trafficking, but collectively, we can all do our parts in doing so, and that starts with education and awareness. Now, the Indigenous population. While precise numbers are hard to come by, in part because of underreporting and lack of consensus about when commercial sex workers cross into being victims of human trafficking, there is supporting data from the United States, Canada, and some of the more than 5 dozen other nations with Indigenous populations that suggest Indigenous women and girls are at a severe risk of being trafficked. Some contributing factors that make this population group at risk is the historical oppression and generational trauma they have had to endure. These moments in history I'm about to share are small insights of the historical traumas Indigenous populations have had to endure. These moments highlight how events such as the Indian boarding school era and the 60s scoop has contributed to putting this population at an even higher risk. Now, in 1860s, in accordance to the Civilization Fund Act, the U.S. government ushered in an era of assimilationist policies leading to the funding of Indian boarding schools. These boarding schools began to pop up all over the United States, and in 1893, the Toma Indian Industrial School, known as the Toma VA Medical Center, was established. In the slide, you will see a picture from the Wisconsin Historical Society. Now, that picture is now the Toma VA Medical Center, but then it was an Indian boarding school. Now, according to the Wisconsin Historical Society, the federal government's intent was, quote unquote, intended to teach Indian children to shed their cultural backgrounds and become more like white class Americans. Psychotherapists, scholars, and tribal members note that a loss of culture and lack of nurturing at such schools throughout the state and country led to a breakdown of community and family within the Native American population. While the Toma Indian Industrial School closed in 1941, there were still boarding schools being operated throughout the state until 1978. Now, an intersecting moment in history was that of the 60s scoop. While its name suggests it had taken place in one decade, the 60s scoop began in the late 1950s, and it persisted well into the 1980s. The 60s scoop is a catch-all name for a series of policies enacted by provincial child welfare authorities, which saw thousands of Indigenous children taken from their homes and families and placed in foster care. They were eventually adopted out to white families from across Canada and the United States. These children lost their names, their language, and a connection to their heritage. Statistics from the Department of Indian Affairs reveal a total of 11,132 status Indian children adopted between the years of 1960 and 1990. It is believed, however, that the actual numbers are much higher than that. Many were abused, and the reality is many were potentially trafficked. Eras of boarding school and modern-day welfare systems directly contribute to the Indigenous community being at higher risk of being victims of sex trafficking. Now, our neighboring state, Minnesota Department of Human Services, recognizes that Native American children in Minnesota are more likely to be placed in out-of-home foster care more than any other children. Data from the U.S. Department of State suggests that Trafficking Persons Report 2019 suggests that 60% of human trafficking victims in the United States have histories of being in child welfare. Now, more than 2/3 of Indigenous women engage in prostitution in Minnesota. It is very important to note that due to underreporting and criminalization of victims being exploited, we are not entirely sure if these women are actually engaging in prostitution or if some are victims of human trafficking. The Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Task Force has research that suggests out of those 2/3 of women that engage in prostitution, majority, if not all, are in line with family members who attended boarding schools. So why should we care what our numbers look like in other neighboring states? Well, you don't have to necessarily meet the definition of moving victims across state borders to be considered trafficking. That doesn't mean that traffickers don't take advantage of our connecting highways and interstates when transferring victims to buyers. Interstates and highways such as I-39, I-90, I-94, and Highway 151 that connect big cities and bordering states provide opportunity to move clientele through our rural areas almost undetected. Now, some facts are that Native American women are 2.5 times more likely to be subjected to sexual violence than any other American woman. Native women are stalked more than twice the rate of other women. Native American women are murdered at more than 10 times the national average. In fact, homicide is the third leading cause of death amongst Native American women. And this last fact, non-natives commit 88% of violent crimes against Native American women. Now, the industry largely preys on those who make up the most vulnerable, alienated communities in society. LGBTQ communities, especially youth, are disproportionately affected by violence and stigmatization, making them more susceptible to the coercive influence of human traffickers. Youth who identify as LGBTQ make up 40% of the homeless youth population. Family conflict is one of the most common causes of all youth homelessness. And while that can look different from one person to the next, LGBTQ youth most frequently identify their reasons for becoming homeless was due to family rejection over their sexual orientation or gender identity. A study by the Polaris Project reveals that homeless LGBTQ youth are 7.4 times more likely to experience acts of sexual violence than heterosexual individuals. Driven by parental and societal rejections, bullying, and inadequate support systems, this neglected group is left to fend for themselves on the streets, where 1 in 3 youth are likely to be recruited by a trafficker within 48 hours of leaving home. Polaris Project goes on to explain that traffickers seek to meet the needs of LGBTQ youth as a way to build rapport and dependency. They may offer a sense of family, protection, or love to build a sense of relationship and loyalty. Now, this treatment not only affects youth, but also pours in over to adulthood, where systems, services, and society continues to drive these stigmas and contribute to the hate and alienation of this community. LGBTQ individuals experience homelessness are often at a heightened risk of violence, abuse, and exploitation compared to their heterosexual peers. Oftentimes, homeless LGBTQ persons have great difficulties finding shelters that accept and respect them. Trans people in particular are often turned away from receiving shelter services. Now, according to the National Coalition for the Homeless 2020's report, 43% of clientele served by drop-in centers identified as LGBTQ, 30% of street outreach clients identified as LGBTQ, 30% of clients utilizing housing programs identified as LGBTQ. According to the 2020 LGBTQ People and Housing Affordability, Discrimination, and Homelessness Report, affordable housing is and has always been an issue for Americans over the past few years. But compared to non-LGBTQ people, LGBTQ people have higher rates of poverty, lower rates of home ownership, and higher rates of homelessness. They face an array of stigmas and discrimination that undermine their ability to have stable, safe, and affordable housing. Federal, state, and local laws provide only a patchwork of protection against anti-LGBTQ discrimination in housing, lending, and social services. Now, homelessness is a human trafficking problem, especially for LGBTQ communities, as it is a contributing factor that drives these needs into the hands of human traffickers to fulfill a need. According to the Polaris survey, reported 64% of survivors respondents disclosed being homeless or experienced unstable housing at the time they were recruited into their trafficking situation. The systems of support that are in place to help these individuals are less successful because of harmful social stigmas. The Human Rights Fund identifies the root cause of the discrimination and violence faced by the LGBTQ community is this: failure of service providers and society at large to provide a safe, comfortable, and accepting environment for this community. They go on to further state that our communities as a whole, especially the systems of support that exist within, must strive to not be influenced by the social stigmas that alienate the LGBTQ community. We must control the way we act towards others so that we can protect the livelihood of those who are disproportionately affected by violence and sexual abuse. The driving force that leads the LGBTQ to such dire situations is one we can control, and that is our attitude. And because of this, we must do everything in our power to provide the love that secludes them from the freedoms experienced by most in society. Now, persons with disabilities. The Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center details the vulnerability that increases the risk for individuals with disability to being trafficked. 1 in 4 people in the United States live with a disability. Now, when we're talking persons with disability, we are talking people who have physical disabilities, mental health diagnosis, substance use concern, intellectual or developmental disability. Now, types of trafficking for this population include labor and sex trafficking, but also the theft of Social Security and disability benefits. Vulnerabilities that increase the risk for individuals with disability being trafficked, as noted by Polaris, is individuals with disabilities may have a learned response to comply with the caregiver's wishes due to their dependence on them. Therefore, they may have a normalized and unequal power dynamic in their relationship, which could carry over into their relationship with their traffickers and abusers. People with disabilities may be sheltered and isolated and therefore crave friendships and relationships. They may be aware of their rights to object or reject unwanted touching. They may be unsure of what constitutes a crime and what their rights are as a victim of crime. Traffickers may also target individuals with disabilities because of the social discrimination and prejudice they face. This can cause authorities and even their own family and friends to not believe victims when they report their abuse. This is especially true for victims with disabilities that affect intellectual, cognitive, or communication function, or those individuals with mental health diagnosis. In some cases, the National Hotline has seen it has required a nonprofit organization like Hope House to add their voice to the victim's report before their experiences and needs are addressed properly. We also need to keep in mind that traffickers can be caregivers too. Traffickers seek out the role of caregivers to have access to Social Security and disability benefits. Now, a sex trafficking survivor from the Polaris Survivor Focus Group had shared, "I was born disabled, and this is what led to me being vulnerable to being trafficked. My trafficker played on the fear that my parents instilled in me, that I couldn't hold down a real job or support myself. Like this is the only thing I will ever amount to." Human trafficking is a public health concern that affects individuals, families, and entire communities, including persons with disabilities across generations, according to the Administration for Children and Families, part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Now, healthcare facilities that may work with people living with disabilities included but are not limited to behavioral and mental health centers, drug rehabilitation centers, residential care facilities, and vocational training centers. Some prevention efforts healthcare and social service professionals and settings can do in preventing trafficking in the first place is putting PSAs in waiting rooms, providing community prevention workshops, providing material on healthy relationships, or simply having educated and trauma-informed one-on-one conversations with at-risk clients. Now, for people who are seeking out more training, there is an OVC training that is offered online, and we can certainly send that out to anybody who's interested, the link of where you can register for this training. Now, this training is specifically supporting crime victims with disabilities. It is a 3-day training that is designed for victim service providers, advocates for people with disabilities, self-advocates, and allied professionals. Using case study and small group discussions, you will examine the prevalence of crime against people with disabilities. So if anybody's interested, please type in the chat box and we will be sure to get that out to you. Now, people of color are disproportionately victimized by both sex and labor trafficking in the United States. Women and girls of color bear the brunt of prostitution arrests, often domestic victims of sex trafficking and survivors of sexual exploitation, particularly those of color, are not acknowledged as victims of crime and are instead arrested for prostitution-related offenses. Some argue that the demand for African Americans for sexual exploitation is higher than that of other races, and the penalties associated with trafficking African Americans are less severe. Excuse me. So why might this be, you may ask? Racism fuels policies that have stunted economic opportunities for people of color for generations and generations over time. Stereotypes that dehumanize people of color make it easier to normalize abuse and harder to identify victims. Now, a leading advocacy organization working to improve the lives of marginalized girls, Rights for Girls, state not only are girls of color disproportionately impacted by human trafficking, but they are also the majority of individuals criminalized for their exploitation. A supporting fact from the U.S. Department of Justice reports 52% of juvenile prostitution arrests in the United States are comprised of African American children. They go on to state that 62% or more than half of confirmed sex trafficking victims are African Americans. Now over here you will see the arrest rate by offenses of race in 2019 for juveniles. Most recent supported statistics is from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquent Prevention Programs. They released the arrest rates of juveniles who were arrested for prostitution and commercialized vices in 2019. While I'm sure we're familiar with what prostitution is, some may not be aware of what commercialized vices are. A commercialized vice is an unlawful promotion of or participation in sexual activity for profit, including attempts. Now, before we go into this graph, I would like to note this is federal reporting, so our Latinx population is accounted in the white population. This, along with underreporting, are some examples at why it can be so hard to provide exact numbers and statistics. Now, if you look at this graph, you will see Black juveniles were 2.6 more likely to get arrested than any other race in 2019. I have also included a graph that goes all the way back to 2001 so that you can really see what the numbers reflect, keeping in mind that the Latinx population is included in the white reporting. Now, I only included up until 2001 because that's all that my slide could fit. But looking at data goes well back to the 80s where the Black population of juvenile youth were disproportionately arrested for such quote unquote crimes. Now, I would like to take a moment and reference the language here, and it is that language we see time and time again. Child prostitute, child pornography, pimp or John, referring to these exploitations as relationships. As a society, we need to avoid normalizing human trafficking and abuse. By not calling out for what it is, we're not only minimizing, but also normalizing the crimes that are taking place. Our goal should always remain victim-centered and offender-focused. The only acceptance to this, and it may throw people off a bit, but please bear with me here because I know we have so many people who hold different roles in our communities on this webinar. Some who are trained, and it is in their scope to have these conversations with victims. But I also know there are some who are going to hear this message today who don't necessarily work with victims and survivors in depth or at all, but who care deeply and want to make an impact. I'm going to tell you one of the ways that you can do that. Meet victims where they are. Not all victims know that they're being trafficked. Traffickers are masters of force, fraud, and coercion, and they use these tactics to lure their victims and force them into sexual exploitation. Some victims may very well believe they are in the type of romantic relationship they have craved with their traffickers. That can be an unmet need that a trafficker takes advantage of when luring them in. If a victim refers to their trafficker as someone they are in a relationship, when speaking to that victim, refer to their trafficker in the lens that they see their trafficker through. Leave it to people who are trained with working with sex trafficking victims to have those more in-depth conversations in the crimes that are being committed against them. Sometimes when a person doesn't realize they are being trafficked, it can really scare them because their traffickers have told them things like, if you ever tell anybody or if you go to the police, I will kill you. This can cause a panic and prevent them from connecting with services. You can help in a major way by spotting it and referring them to your local anti-human trafficking agency or other disciplines that are able to have those supporting conversations more in depth. Another reason why we don't want to approach traffickers if we're not trained in doing so is because not only for your safety, but also for the victim's safety. Because after that interaction, the victim is going to be the person who has to pay that price from their trafficker and can be subjected to even more abuse if we're approaching them and we don't have the means or training to do so. So please, if you see it, contact places like anti-human trafficking organizations such as Hope House, police departments. If you suspect that maybe one of the kids at your child's school may be being trafficked, talking to the school social worker or people like that. Now, imagine at the age of 16 being sex trafficked by a pimp named Cutthroat. After days of being repeatedly drugged and raped by different men, you were purchased by a 43-year-old child predator who took you to his home and used you for sex. You end up finding enough courage to fight back and shot and killed him. You're arrested as a result, tried, and convicted as an adult and sentenced to life in prison. Now, this sounds like a real nightmare, doesn't it? Well, unfortunately, for those who aren't aware, this was the exact reality for Centoya Brown, a human trafficking survivor who was 16 years old at the time of her arrest. Now, in August of 2006, Centoya Brown was convicted of first-degree murder and robbery. Prosecutors argued her real motive was robbery, and despite her young age of 16, she was tried as an adult. She was sentenced to 2 life sentences. Centoya was not allowed to testify in her trial, and her attorney failed to enter in evidence that supported her traumatic childhood history and severe neurodevelopment disorder, as evident in her fetal alcohol disorder. There was no initial public outcry about the way she was treated, that she was a child, or that the man she killed was a 43-year-old pedophile. It wasn't until 2017 when Centoya's case started to catch the attention of celebrities, like Rihanna is the one who posted that description to social media that I just shared. And it caught wind of people like Kim Kardashian, Snoop Dogg, LeBron James, and several other US-based celebrities, who in turn lobbied for Centoya Brown's release. She was granted clemency and was released on August 7, 2019, to supervised parole exactly 15 years after her arrest. Now, Centoya's case has similar elements to an open case right now taking place right here in Wisconsin, and that is the state of Wisconsin versus Crystal Kaiser. If you didn't know, now you know, and I highly encourage everyone to familiarize themselves with this case. While Crystal is out on bail, the fight for justice for the survivor is not over. Now, I'd like to leave off with a direct quote from a woman by the name of Mimi Crown. Mimi Crown is a survivor of sex trafficking. She states, "I actually did not know what human trafficking was until it happened to me." Crown, who wrote the fictional book Stuck in Traffic, adding some of her experiences, "I was reading an article literally just last year about a woman who was rescued from being trafficked, and in the story, it gave detail of what happened to her. I said, wow, that sounds just like what I went through." Now, Mimi Crown said she would tell the politicians to stop treating victims and survivors of human trafficking like criminals. She said these women have gone through unimaginable ordeals, and the last thing they need is to have a finger being pointed at them. Did she rob somebody? Yes. But would she have done it if her pimp had not first held a gun to her head? So stop judging and start helping. Now, tips for citizens who want to help. Let's just not do something, let's do the best thing. And that is a quote from somebody named Dr. Cecilia Williamson. Now, Dr. Cecilia Williamson was named one of the top 30 most influential social workers alive. She has over 25 years of human trafficking practice, research, and teachings. She also has a book out for anyone who's interested. It's entitled A Seat at the Table, The Courage to Care About Trafficking Victims. Now, tips for citizens. Tip 1, recognize that human trafficking does take place in rural areas and has been reported in all 72 counties of Wisconsin. Now, if you look at this graph, this is a graph that I pulled from Polaris that shows where human trafficking is over the state of Wisconsin. Now, keeping in mind, this is a crime that goes severely unreported. So it is estimated that there are many, many more that we don't know about. Now, if you look at Wisconsin, you can see that it's pretty lit up, but also look at the bordering states. They are also lit up. Now, the next tip is spread truths, not myths and misinformation. Do your research and spread the truth about trafficking, not the false social media narratives that are posted like Sarah had referenced to. Traffickers are not following you around Walmart, where there are tons of cameras, and to the parking lot to block your car with their license plate for the world to see and running off with you. This is not human trafficking. Now, that's not to say there isn't some type of crime that is being committed, but we need to boldly put a halt to the misconceptions that this is what it looks like, because it masks what it truly is and aids in human trafficking continuing to be hidden in plain sight. Now, this next tip is for parents and guardians, and that is prevention. Get ahead of the problem. Do not wait until you start to see what you feel are signs that your child or teen may be being trafficked. Inform them on what traffickers may promise them, whether that's promising them a great life of love, of that designer handbag, or the newest iPhone they've always wanted. Maybe it's friendship. Having age-related, age-appropriate conversations and warning them about the scary truths and making them aware of what traffickers might say to them. They may tell children and teens, if you tell anyone, I will hurt you or your family. Traffickers may even guilt children by saying that they'll hurt themselves. Let them know that this is the way that traffickers keep kind of a control over them. And this is a way that traffickers scare kiddos and teens into not telling a trusted adult in their life. While yes, this is not an easy conversation to have with a child, and sometimes it's hard to know what to say or how to navigate these conversations, it is nonetheless important and can potentially save their lives. If you would like guidance or tips on how to have age-appropriate conversations, please feel free to call Hope House and connect with an advocate. We'd be more than happy to talk through it with you. But this tip alone not only opens up the conversation, it also creates a safety plan between you and your child for open communication and increases the chance of your child or teen coming to you to disclose if something is happening to them. I'd also like to echo further what Sarah said. Monitor your children and teens' social media. This is how traffickers are getting a hold of your kiddos. While yes, they deserve levels of respect and trust and empowerment, at the end of the day, it is our job as parents and guardians to ensure their safety. Now, this next tip, reach out to legislation. There are 2 actionable items to note that need action now, and that is the safe harbor laws. For anybody who doesn't know what a safe harbor law is, it prevents minors, any child under the age of 18, from being prosecuted for prostitution. It directs juvenile sex trafficking victims to non-punitive specialized services. Now, in the state of Wisconsin, we do need to toughen our safe harbor laws. We actually don't have any, so that is why it's so important. If you would like to make change, reach out to your legislation. Another actionable item is the state of Wisconsin versus Crystal Kaiser. Learn about her case and know how you can support her. Now, this last tip. I know all this information can feel a little overwhelming and leave one wondering, but what can I do? And it truly is more simple than it sounds. Polaris and United Way are joining forces to say, the best defense against human trafficking are healthy families and strong communities. Because human trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum, our responses can't either. As we embark on a new year, join us in the fight to dismantle the systems that allow human trafficking to exist. Fighting racism is fighting human trafficking. Upholding LGBTQ equality is fighting human trafficking. Providing safe and affordable housing is fighting human trafficking. And protecting workers' rights is fighting human trafficking. Hope House would like to echo this message and hope that you do too. If you or someone you know is being trafficked or you want to learn more, please reach out to Hope House. We are here for you. Contact our 24-hour helpline at 1-800-584-6790.
All right, thank you. I am just gonna kind of open it up if anybody wants to ask any quick questions. I know also we had one last thing to share if, there, okay, we should see it now. Go ahead, Deb.
Oh, me?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I guess we could take I know we're over time. If anybody does want to add anything to the chat, or you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask Sarah or Danny a question.
I just wanted to note, we definitely value your time. So if you need to jump off, that's fine. If you submitted a question and it wasn't answered in the presentation today, I'm going to reach out to you directly. There were some more direct questions and I want to be able to give those the time and attention that they need. So that'll be happening as well.
And I'll just throw in there as well, there may be some questions coming, but thanks again for joining us. And there will be a link in the chat box for an evaluation if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to complete that. And also just to remind you, our education team and advocates are available for presentations. And if you'd like to schedule your own free training, please don't hesitate to contact us, and have a wonderful day, and everyone stay healthy out there.
So I do see a question here, and that is, do you have any tips of what to look for? So tips to look for would be, let's say if somebody appears to not have access to means like housing, maybe employment, things like that, and they're all of a sudden having these lavish items like the newest iPhone or purses or things like that, that can be kind of a clue that somebody may be being trafficked. Another identifying mark is maybe they come into your emergency room and there's somebody with them who refuses to leave their side. They won't allow them to even go to the bathroom for a urine specimen. And they say that maybe they're a boyfriend, maybe they're a family member, or things like that, but they don't know information that boyfriends and family members should know in depth about a person. Other things to look for is maybe somebody is timid. Maybe they look to somebody else to answer for them. Maybe they have answers that sound just very scripted, things of that nature. And I'm sure Sarah has more that she can add to that as well.
I would say, you know, and I think Danny touched on this a little bit in her presentation too, that no matter what we tell you to look for, even whatever you think that situation might look like, it might not be that, which is why we recommend calling us or calling law enforcement and not approaching them yourself. Sometimes things that we have seen is a victim won't have control over their finances. So they don't carry a debit card, they don't carry an ID, things of that nature. I'm trying to think of other big ones that we've seen. Danny hit a lot of the ones that are probably going to be most in your face, and the ones that you're going to notice the most. I know that we said trafficking is pretty subtle, and it can be, but you're probably, yeah. I mean, there's other things like if a teenager is in the company of a way older man that's not her parent or guardian, or their parent or guardian, I should say, or if they're checking into hotels with someone that's much older than them, that can be something of a red flag too. I know a lot of the hotels in the Wisconsin Dells area, they've had trainings on how to recognize trafficking and things of that nature too. And that's something that we're hoping to expand on as well, just to kind of be like, hey, be on the lookout for this, because those frontline workers, they're going to be the people that most often will come into contact with trafficking victims first, the hospitals, the police, and then hospitality around here for sure. Is there more?
Let's see. So here's another one. It says, I understand that sex trafficking does not generally happen by someone being taken, but there are a lot of videos circulating over social media with videos of 1F/1M marketing on cars, houses, as well as notes, ribbons on cars or in shopping malls. How common or legit would you say this is? And are these people typically targeted and followed or viewed one day at random?
I think that there are things that people do that can be misinterpreted as something else. For instance, I have seen posts online about people who have gotten something weird in their mailboxes, and it actually turned out to be just a person who was concerned about maybe the end of days or things that are happening in their community. So it's not always what we think it is. I think that they're not as common as I have seen. I haven't seen a lot of these videos at all. People aren't usually targeted or targeted in that way. That abduction piece is just, it's not there. It's not there in the way that we think it is. It is so much easier for them to come at you online. So in that way, they might be targeted. If they can identify that person and someone randomly messages you in instant messenger, I think that might be a way that you're targeted, but not followed, not abducted, not taken off the street kind of thing. I wouldn't say that that is what's going to happen. It's more likely we'll find out who you are and get to you that way, if at all.
So Sarah, I know something common that we see, but maybe you can just go a little bit more in depth in that. What do traffickers look like?
They can be anybody. So again, the traffickers that we typically think of, I mean, I know that I'm kind of going to go back to what you mentioned with the Walmart thing. There's a lot of people that call law enforcement because they think it looks a certain way because of the own biases that they might have. And that's typically not what is happening. And so before you call law enforcement on somebody like that, I would take a minute to think about how that might impact them, especially if that's not the situation that's happening. I, again, wish that I had a crystal ball, but traffickers can look like parents. They can look like school principals and teachers. They can look like your boyfriend. They can be a foster parent, and they can be your friend. So we talked, I saw in the chat earlier where we talked a little bit about recruiters. Recruiters are often victims themselves. They will approach you as a friend or in a different way, maybe online, maybe in a store, but not likely, just because, again, it's so easy for them to be identified and they like to operate as much in secret as possible. But when they do that, it's not going to be overt. It's not going to be, I'm approaching you. I want you to come work for this guy. It's going to be that, hey, what do you have going on? Like they're going to bond with you. They'll talk to you. And then they kind of make an ask to hang out, or they'll be like, I have this great business opportunity or something like that. Kind of like multi-level marketing, if we want to put it in that way, like this person is doing this thing and it's their job to go find out and recruit those other people to do the same thing. If that's a good analysis. Is that helpful?
That is. I do want to piggyback off of what Sarah had said as well. We had attended a seminar that actually had a survivor who had spoke, and she herself wasn't trafficked, but what was happening, and she was a school age kiddo at the time, she was a student, her father was using her to go recruit girls at her school, befriend them, bring them back to her home, and he would rape them, and he would film these rapes, and he would post them online, and he would send them to his friends, his whoever. So traffickers can use somebody in that way to traffic other people. She does state that it wasn't until because he would drug these girls when he would assault them, and she stated it wasn't until one of the girls came to her and approached her because she remembered what had happened to her the night before that she found the courage to speak out and tell. And what had happened was she was sent to a foster care system, and she said like her foster care family were wonderful to her, but they still didn't believe her that her dad had committed these crimes, and they viewed him as a great man because that's what the community viewed him as. So it's important to know you're not going to get that scary figure that's lurking in the alleyway. It can literally be a community member that everybody knows, loves, and respects.
And I think, Tina, what you were saying, you learn that victims many times end up knowing the trafficker. I would like to find stats on that. And stats are so hard to come by in this work sometimes. But I would say that in the cases that I personally have seen, yes, they were introduced through somebody else, or it was their boyfriend's friend, or their partner, their parents, their foster parents. Most likely that's what happened. I've also had people who, through the course of my work, and this isn't always going to lead to trafficking, but when I would go to the hospital and I would see sexual assault victims, and I said, when we ask, how do you know this person? Some people said, oh, they reached out to me on Facebook and we were just kind of talking. And I'm like, did you know them? Did you have any friends in common? She's like, no, I just thought he was hot. Like, so it's sometimes random, but more often than not, from my personal experience, it's somebody that you know or someone adjacent that you know.
I do want to add just a little bit to that, just to really hone in on how it is in our rural areas and how we are seeing signs of it. One of our local multidisciplinary teams, one of the highest trends that they recognized that were happening amongst sexual assault victims were that the perpetrator oftentimes were family or parents. So it's really important, as Sarah said, to realize that parents can traffic kiddos.
And it's hard to hear. And we know that we gave you a ton of information today, and it can be overwhelming and a lot to take in and separate and be like, okay, I have all of this information. What exactly can I do again? And we're definitely here to talk. If you have questions, if you want something, or you want to process something a little bit more, or you think that, okay, I think I understand it this way, am I correct? You can definitely reach out to us and we're happy to help with that.
Well, great. Again, thank you all for attending today. I hope you learned a lot. I know I did. And again, reach out to us if you'd like a presentation of your own, or if you have any questions or need clarification. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.